Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. And with me is my affable co-host, Caleb. Caleb, what's up, man? It's been a little while.
I gotta get my dictionary out. I don't know what that means.
I'm pretty proud of myself. I pulled that one up out of my butt because usually I go to thesaurus.com and I enter in awesome and then I just rip, whatever word I haven't used for awesome. This is what I use. That one I did not prepare for and I pulled it out of my butt, so it's accurate. You are affable.
Good. And we've said "but" 3 times now in the first 2 minutes. Perfect.
The middle schoolers will love this.
That's what we're going for. That's our audience.
That's right. Speaking of middle schoolers, we're back again to talk about our experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that has shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to old friends about their faith journey spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of someone who grew up during that era. Caleb, tell us, who are we talking to?
Yeah, we're going to talk to a philosopher, a biker, a friend of mine from the Twitterverse, is where I met him first. It is Todd from Iowa.
Todd from Iowa.
I don't know why I added the Iowa.
We had Nick from college. Now it's Todd from Iowa.
Right.
It's like a surname thing.
I gotta find the last name because we try and avoid the last names. So it does mean I've noticed that as sometimes we say it and I'm like, I feel it's very anticlimactic. It's
That's
Bob.
Bob from high school.
Yeah.
No, so Todd joined us. I don't know, he's been on your music podcast, of course, but great dude to talk to. Really, really thorough with his thoughts. You'll find that he went down some really interesting paths for conversation, which I appreciated, even though I couldn't fully follow at times. After a re-listen, I was like, all right, I get it. So this one might be one where you listen to a couple of times to fully understand, but man, he really, really dives deep into the philosophical aspects of his faith, which not a lot of people are willing or get to do.
Yeah, he ended up with, he talks about it, a master's degree in philosophy, and that's something that clearly he was passionate about, and so that impacted his view of faith, and he kind of walks through the things he looked into, and the things he dove into, and the things that impacted that view of faith, and how it, kind of played with that philosophical approach. It's a very unique look at it. Like like you said, I don't think many people are sitting there going, well, what philosopher best represents my faith? We just don't do that.
Is this a Kierkegaard philosophy? Is this Kierkegaard thing or a Comte thing? Like, yeah, we're not.
There's just not a lot of people doing that, and even in highly educated circles, I don't think there is. And so it's a unique look at it, and that's what we're trying to do: is get that. What's your perspective on how you got here? And you get the details here.
To be clear, Todd didn't seem like he was quoting Kierkegaard in 90s youth group. That's more of where he kind of got to.
Yes.
But you got to listen to his whole story to figure out why and how he got there, which was fun for me. But also, too, it reminded me of how much work has been done behind the scenes, whether it's the theology aspect of it, the philosophy aspect of it, all this work that's been done over hundreds of years to kind of get us where we are today, that we often are just simply ignorant of, not willfully, just, we're just ignorant of because we don't have the time to understand it. And Todd has taken the time to understand it, and the journey he takes to get there is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Todd, thank you very much for joining us. If you want to follow Todd online, all of his handles are at Socrates on a bike. That is because he's a philosopher and he also loves to mountain bike, which is pretty sweet. And I think he's mostly active on Instagram, also on X, Twitter, and other spots. So Socrates on a bike is where you can find Todd. If you out there, the listener, would like to join us and share your story, we'd love to hear from you. We're always looking for guests to interview. So if you'd like to join us for a conversation, please reach out to us. Really easy to do so. Best way to do that, to touch base with Caleb and I, is email us at isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. Once again, isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. We'll get you on the list. We'll get you scheduled. We'd love to chat with you. Again, there are no wrong answers in this conversation. We just want to know what your journey is. Maybe you'll disagree with us, or maybe it's way off, or maybe it's kind of just right in line with what you thought it would be. No matter what, we want to hear from you. We like these stories very much. Once again, thanks very much for listening, and we hope you enjoy.
I want to quickly remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s may not be held by or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead we want to let people share how they feel. During our interviews and discussions, we may not represent every point of view on a given subject, and we understand that this may be frustrating at times, but it is the nature of a podcast discussion with a limited amount of time. We also know and want to acknowledge that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remember the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show.
Okay, we are joined by our friend Todd, another music fan that Caleb has made friends with. Definitely not a bad thing. Lots of interests that we share. But Todd, we've tried to set this up a couple of times, and finally we did it. So thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. And apparently music must be Caleb's love language. So
It is.
That's how he makes his friends.
Definitely the case.
It is kind of become, that's funny that you would say that, because it kind of is like, I can talk about music even if people like talk about stuff I don't care about. It's like, you want to talk about that? Great, I'll listen.
Last night I went on a bike ride with Brock. He's in Iowa right now. So we were talking about the confluence of interests, how we're both into music, and he and I both happen to be sort of avid cyclists, so
nice.
I took him on a ride there's a rail trail here that's pretty popular, the Wabash Trail. Mm-hmm. And we rode about 20 miles on there and grabbed some dinner, so it was a good time.
Yeah, Brock, I think that episode came back out all the way in January, so we've had a pretty good run.
Brock, friend of the podcast.
friend of many podcasts.
Yeah.
So anyway, Todd, we again, appreciate you having you on and look forward to hearing about your experience and your journey here. As always, we'll start from the beginning. When, how, where were you attending youth group, and was it in the 90s?
Yes, so 90s into early 2000s. So I graduated high school in 2003. Starting in like junior high and youth group, I suppose. So it would have been the late 90s. Went to a little church called Sherwood Community Church. And if you're familiar with the Christian Missionary Alliance denomination, at least at that time, that's what they tended to call their church, something community church. So Sherwood Community Church of the CMA. And I was always a very involved in church sort of kid. My family was very involved. My dad was a church elder and sort of like lay minister sort of guy. Like he was often the person who would replace the minister while the minister was on sabbatical and stuff. So family was very involved in church. And I always really enjoyed youth group.
Were your parents involved in the youth group at all, or was it just kind of the larger church?
Just a larger church. And our church wasn't huge. It was a church of, 100, 120 people. My parents were not involved in youth group specifically. I think they did some other things on Wednesday nights, though, so they would be there. It's like a lot of churches, youth group was a Wednesday night thing. My mom was a deaconess, and they had, I think, their deacon board meetings on Wednesday nights. And my dad, they might have even been having, like, their elder board meetings once a month on Wednesday nights or something. But anyway, so they were around, but they were not involved in youth group. Now, we had, interestingly, I don't think we ever had, as far as I know, I was a kid, so I guess I wouldn't know, but at least I was never told, but I don't think we, at that church, because I did have sort of a transition in high school to a different church, but we didn't have like any sort of paid youth minister. It was more, there were members of the church that I think sort of volunteered to lead the youth group thing. So the second church I went to, which was Eastside Christian Church, around like when I was maybe a sophomore in high school, I think we switched to there. That's part of, there's the whole like Christian / Church of Christ movement, which interests me because they call themselves not a denomination. even though they're an organization that has, like, they own universities and things. But anyway, the Christian / Church of Christ movement, that was the church I ended up going to in high school. And we did have, like, an actual sort of youth minister there. It was a similarly sized church, but yeah, they actually had a youth minister. And he was a really good guy. He would, I know that they were like, you know, he was someone who would take in like troubled youth and stuff, you know, so I think he had a heart for young people.
Nice. Okay, let's, not the first time we've heard like a volunteer youth pastor situation. I think that was happening more than we realized. But good on him or those people or whoever was volunteering to make it happen.
I think, you know, and maybe in part because it was just this sort of volunteer thing, it seemed like it was sort of a revolving door. Like, you know, it's almost hard for me to remember, like, you know, I'm like, yeah, there were various people. One of the most interesting ones, there was a while they sort of turned the youth group over to, we had this guy who was really into the idea of like, you know, sort of knowing about like cults and the occult, so you could, I guess, potentially, like, if you're gonna go witness to someone who's a member of a cult or whatever. So that created some controversy though within the church, because some of the other church members were like, well, you're teaching our kids about like what these cults believe, like what if they just think it's, you know, tempting or whatever, I don't know, like,
sure.
So that was an interesting chapter in all of that, was the guy who, yeah, it was like, hey, I'm going to teach you all about these other religions. So when you have to go be a Christian apologist, I guess, and, you know, talk to them about religion, you know what to tell them and stuff. But,
yeah. I think that fear was real back then. They didn't want us exposed to information because they thought the information itself would just tempt us.
Yeah.
As if the whatever was being taught was inherently tempting. When oftentimes it's not. It's just, you know, a good prep.
Yeah, my dad was really afraid, I think, when I went into philosophy. This is, you know, foreshadowing. For those who know of me, know I ended up doing a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in philosophy, which is a very not religious field, which I don't think a lot of people realize that who are not in the field. Like, it's predominantly atheistic and agnostic. You know, religious people are seen as sort of a minority group within the philosophy academia field. But my dad was like amazed, sort of, like, though not in a horrible way. Like, he was more like proud. He's like, yeah, my son is just willing to go hang out with these atheists and stuff. I'm like, yeah, I guess I am.
Nice. Well, clearly grew up in a Christian home, a lot of involvement there. Just for you personally, how was your faith living itself out in the 90s while you were in youth group? What did it look like back then?
I would say that at that time, and up until partway through college, I was I don't know if it's the right word is standard, I don't know, a pretty middle of the road, like, standard, like, sort of conservative evangelical Christian, I think is the best way to describe it. You know, I was very certain of my faith. And that's how I ended up in philosophy, is I thought I was going to be like an apologist. You know, I was going to be someone like a William Lane Craig or something like that, who's going to go, you know, give people all the right answers to all of their questions about life. Because I was that sure that I had those answers. So that's what my faith was like. I was very devoted to going to church. I was very much, you know, someone who, and I've always been a naturally, you know, good student, I guess is the best way to put it, you know, so like, you know, I was very good at, you know, remembering scriptures and stuff. And so, you know, often I felt like that was my thing, either that or I thought I might become a youth minister. I never did, but yeah, that was, and then, you know, thought maybe a minister. Eventually, though, I went into philosophy thinking I'm going to be an academic, so I can just be in an office somewhere. People can come ask me questions, and I can just guide them on life. Was, I think, like what I had envisioned at that time when I ended up going. But anyway, yeah, so I'd say I was very sure of my faith, and I was, conservative evangelical Christian, I think would be the best way to put it. Like, the Christian Missionary Alliance is a historically sort of Wesleyan Arminian theology type of denomination, though it doesn't, within its like statement of faith, have anything specifically about that. So from what I understand, as like the Reformed movement in the U.S. seems to have grown, more CMA churches have become Reformed, I think. But when I was younger, and at that time I wouldn't have even been able to tell you what that meant, but I think my own view of Christianity is definitely very sort of Wesleyan Arminian, because that's what I grew up in. Even though at the time I just thought that's just is the correct Christianity, the correct Protestant Christianity is to be a Wesleyan Arminian sort of person. But
I didn't really understand anything else until kind of my college years, and certainly when Caleb started getting into the Reform stuff, I was like, huh? But I mean, it's a path people go down, and some people stay there. But I find it interesting that as a youth, you were like, I just want to sit and talk to people. That's what I want to do.
I know. If only podcasting had been invented at that time, I could have sat and talked to lots of people.
Yeah.
You know what's funny? And this is not the most influential book, but a book that gave me that idea. And it's funny because Brock and I were actually talking about this last night. The book that gave me that idea was The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. So he has The Case for Christ, which is more about like historical evidence for Christianity, I think is more like what The Case for Christ is supposed to be. Yep. Case for Faith is more his like philosophical book. And he goes and talks to a bunch of these philosophers like that are Christians and sort of asks them like how they respond to things like the problem of evil and whatnot. And I think I was literally inspired to be like, I could be one of those guys.
Nice.
Like, if someone wants to come to my office at a university and ask me questions, I can do that.
And interview me. Yeah,
exactly. Interview me.
All right.
I'm smart.
Nothing wrong with that.
I can answer your questions.
Just takes a few years of training, that's all.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what about youth group itself? What are some of those memories that pop up when you think of your youth group setting? Games, activities, trips you took, teaching moments, that sort of thing.
The things I remember the best were 3 trips to Cornerstone Music Festival that my youth group went on. Yeah, so we were here in the Midwest in Iowa. So it was probably, I don't know, an 8-hour drive or something from here to get to Bushnell, Illinois, where Cornerstone was. So that was huge for me. That's where I first was able to see Five Iron Frenzy in concert and the Supertones and MC Hammer and MXPX and Fine China. Was able to buy a CD from one of the first emo and maybe one of the last emo CDs I ever really bought was from the Appleseed Cast. They were selling their CD unofficially, like out of the back of a van at Cornerstone.
Nice.
Me and my friends hated it so much that we got back home and had a party where we destroyed them all with like a baseball bat.
Whoa.
But later, when I got to grad school, I met another Christian guy who was a huge fan of the Appleseed Cast, and I felt bad. I'm like, oh man, you love this band? I had one encounter with them in like 1998 when I was a teenager, and I literally hated their music. But yeah.
Dang.
So anyway, yeah, Cornerstone was huge for me. It's a bunch of kids in like a van or whatever. And then, we just camped out at Cornerstone. They had the lake there. You could go, spend time at the beach. You could go to the big merch area. I almost got convinced to go join Japuza when I graduated high school, like the Christian commune in Chicago that ran Cornerstone. One of their like actual staff members sort of took me under his wing one year and almost had convinced me to like sell all my possessions and come join Japuza when I graduated high school. But I had just gotten a car. And I was like, I'm going to sell my car to go join these guys living with a bunch of like stinky hippies in a building in Chicago.
I was not aware that, well, first of all, Cornerstone was like the Mecca
Yeah,
right?
like sometimes like 30,000 people would come to Cornerstone.
And we had our own thing called Sunshine. Maybe you came up here for Sunshine, but like that was what our youth pastor would do, is bring us Sunshine, which was all well and good. It was a great time, but man, Cornerstone was like that was the place to go. But I had no idea that it was run by a Christian commune.
Yeah,
group.
it was run by a Christian, and the commune still exists. Yeah, JPUSA,
Whoa.
Jesus People USA.
Okay.
Which is in Chicago. They apparently, I've never been there. They have like a large building that's sort of like their place, and they run various businesses to sort of help pay for the whole thing. Like I think they have like, at least at the time, like they had like a yard work company, like they had like a construction company. Like they did all these things to sort of pay for everything. And they had like a soup kitchen and stuff. And yeah, they're a big Christian commune in Chicago. Yeah, they actually ran Cornerstone. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was, and maybe as a foreshadowing of the fact that I would go into philosophy, one thing Cornerstone had that I think a lot of maybe other Christian music festivals didn't, they had many different tents going on that were not music. They were just like talks.
Yeah.
Like academic style talks.
Yeah.
And I would spend some of my afternoons there, like listening to talks, some of them very political, like against like U.S. intervention in the Middle East. Like, like there was all sorts of things going on at Cornerstone other than just the music stuff.
When it was safe to have those conversations.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it was actually Andy Mandel, who was the lead singer of Ballydouse, the like Christian, like sort of Celtic punk band. He was the guy he was a member of JPUSA, and he almost had me convinced to come join them.
Wow. So close.
I did not. And I think I made the right choice.
Sure.
But,
sure.
Yeah.
Well, you're an intellectual guy. What about some teaching moments that are still with you? Like, what are some things that you learned back then that you still think about a lot?
That's a good question. I think that one of the things from like church at that time and, like youth group, it's sort of weird because I don't have many specific memories of youth group. The most of the memories I have of like my youth group era in church are like more just the hanging out with my friends after youth group sort of thing. The youth group itself is not that memorable for me. I think that if I had to say there was a biggest influence, though, and this really, though, comes from my dad, who, like I said, was very involved in our church. He was always, and sometimes he would help teach some stuff for the youth group. He was very into the idea of Christ being foreshadowed in the Old Testament. Like different passages in the Old Testament and characters in the Old Testament being like foreshadowing of Christ. So maybe more than some other churches, because I've been to churches where almost all of the preaching is done out of the New Testament. There was actually a lot of like Old Testament and like using it as a background for the New Testament. I know that's maybe a weird lesson to take out of it all, but yeah, that's, if I could say anything from that period that would like differentiate my own views from a lot of others, maybe that might be it.
But I remember that sort of stuff coming up for us. Like we would talk about, do you know that there's this many prophecies? Because it tied into some of that, like,
apologetics.
The apologetics.
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
I'm so sorry. It ties into that apologetics thing. Is like, look at all these prophecies that now have all come true. And even when you talked about the cult thing, like when we had a teaching on a cult, I remember having like a summer series in Sunday school. It wasn't in youth group. It was in Sunday school where we would go before church and they were going through this is the cult of the week. And I think those sort of apologetics things, so yes, maybe it wasn't a lot of preaching from the pulpit, but I think that's when that whole reference back to the Old Testament as foreshadowing started to become a thing. And then it really is a huge thing in Reformed theology. Like my time at Bethlehem it was talked about all the time, this idea that, and it's still helpful for me today, the idea that the entire Bible is about Jesus, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, it's all about him. And that is actually something that I still appreciate to this day. So anyway, I think you started to see the the beginnings of that early on in the 90s and kind of come mainstream.
And also for me, in a way, youth group, in a way, didn't really stop with, like, high school. Because, in a way, I feel like my involvement in college in Campus Crusade was basically like youth group for college kids. We had, a once-a-week little, like, worship service thing we had at, like, one of the auditoriums at my university, And I was very involved in Campus Crusade. And then in grad school, even stayed involved in InterVarsity, which is just another Christian college student organization. So in a way that continued on for me. And then after grad school, then I guess there really wasn't, when you're not plugged into like a college and like, that was how I stayed in one of those groups. That's when it really sort of ended for me, was after grad school, no more InterVarsity, but.
Well, you've checked both boxes for Caleb and I, because I know Caleb did Crusade at Stout, and I did InterVarsity at St. Olaf, where I went to college. So
there you go. Yeah, I was involved in Campus Crusade at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. That's where I did my bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
Then InterVarsity at Boulder, University of Colorado, where I did my master's.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other, as far as like a big aspect of that might be a little different for me and might have something to do with the flow of my life overall, I was actually more involved in college in the Impact movement, which was Campus Crusade's ministry for African American students.
Okay.
And I totally fell into it by accident. I was literally sitting in like the sort of like, food hall area at the campus, cafeteria, I guess is the proper term. I just could not think of. I was sitting in the cafeteria area and I saw this group of students like doing a Bible study, and I'm like, hey, I'm a Christian. I should get involved in this, So I got in, and it turned out that was actually the local chapter of the Impact movement.
Okay.
So I went to multiple Impact conferences. That's when I got to, I saw a lot of Christian hip hop acts, because like Cross Movement was basically one of the main like musical acts at most of the Impact conferences and stuff. So, saw the Ambassador and all the, a lot of different sort of big Christian hip hop acts at that time.
Nice.
And just for the visual, so everybody can connect the dots, but they don't know Todd. Todd's is white. So I just want to have that out there, because,
yes,
you're going on and on about like I got super involved in this, and it is an interesting aspect. Is you're not?
I am white.
You're Iowa white. I'm sorry, that was probably too much.
White. Yeah. So awesome. I got involved in Impact, and a lot of my best friends I had in college are all from the Impact movement and stuff. So it was a big part of my life at that time.
Nice. So you were involved a little bit after high school, and maybe not your youth group, but things that kind of extended as youth groups. So like
parachurch sort of organizations that are sort of youth group-esque. Yeah. I guess you guys have probably talked about this. I felt like one of the biggest differences between being involved in Campus Crusade and Impact versus InterVarsity is Campus Crusade had a lot bigger emphasis on like going out and witnessing on the campus, whereas InterVarsity specifically, like our minister for InterVarsity specifically said they were more about like discipleship, like just building up Christians, and not so much about going out and evangelizing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, at least from my perspective on InterVarsity. It wasn't so much the campus outreach, although there of course was a little bit of that, but it was more like, let's have the like you said, discipleship set up. So it's all right. Every group has their little use on campus, that's for sure. So overall, just what did you love about that youth group experience that you had?
I think it was mostly just the, camaraderie, companionship, friendships. Like I said, and it might not be specifically much about youth group as far as like why I don't remember a lot of lessons. I feel like I couldn't tell you many specific memories of things I learned in high school either. Like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm just getting old and my memory is not that great. But, what I really remember is more, just the hanging out with my friends, I remember, doing stupid stuff. Like I broke a collarbone. It was the winter and we were having like, there's just snow outside the church. And I thought it would be really cool to like run up and do like a flip and land on the other side of this snowbank and like slide down it. But I ended up just landing on my shoulder when I did this flip and broke my collarbone.
Nice.
Me and my friends, playing basketball in the church parking lot in the summer. Those are a lot of the things I really remember from youth group. So I did really enjoy it. But yeah, what I remember the most is the camaraderie, the friendships you make. So,
did a lot of your youth group friends also go to the high school you were at? Was it like kind of the same friend group, or did you have a bit of a divide?
Not really, no. So it was a bit of so there was a little overlap, which was sort of intentional because basically two of my high school friends who weren't even really involved in our church otherwise, I was able to get them to start coming to our youth group, and my parents would my dad would pick them up and bring us all to youth group on Wednesday night. Mm-hmm. But other than that, no, I had a totally separate sort of friend group at school. Here's one interesting thing that I guess I did as far as youth group in my youth group high school days. I tried to create my own interdenominational parachurch organization. I tried to create my own, I called it an interdenominational youth group, where we would have our own meetings and stuff. And it was just us high schoolers. Yeah. I wrote up a set of bylaws and a statement of faith, and we signed it, and we created an executive board, and I got elected to be the president of this organization. And so we basically created our own separate youth group. It didn't really do a whole lot other than ended up organizing one Christian concert. I got a local Christian alternative band called Jacob's Well to put on a concert for the year 2000 New Year at our local YMCA gymnasium. Yeah, that was that's something I did involving youth group.
What was this group called? Did you have a special name for it?
Yeah, it even had a website. So if the website's long gone, but maybe the Wayback Machine or the Internet Archive could find it. But the CBIYG, because I'm from Council Bluffs, so the Council Bluffs Interdenominational Youth Group.
All right, that's good acronym.
I don't know. As much as I think of myself as an introverted person, I tend to end up creating a lot of movements and organizations. Mm-hmm. It tends to be a thing I do. I've got a cycling club that I'm the leader of right now. I ended up I'm a trail leader. I volunteer as the top volunteer, in charge of this nature trail, and maintaining it. And it's often because I think something needs to be done that nobody else is doing, basically. Sure. So I feel I begrudgingly step up and do it. So
introverts can do a lot of things that include people if they're passionate about it.
That's true. Yeah, the organization, the CBIYG, it involved basically me, and I had friends though from high school who went to other churches in town. Like I said, it didn't really, it's funny looking back, how serious we took it though, because we would have meetings and, we followed Robert's Rules of Order and passed rules on things and whatnot. And the organization hardly did anything beyond that. Other than, like I said, we ended up organizing one concert, though that was really mostly me under the auspices of, I've got this organization, I'm going to put on a concert. But it was really me. And the thing is, I was not even able to drive yet. So the guys from this band, who I think were in their 20s, they were actually super impressed, though. They're there's this 13-year-old kid who put together this concert.
Wow.
And the Y was happy because we did it at the YMCA. So they're this will be a cool thing to have. They ended up doing a lock-in at the YMCA overnight that night. So we actually had the concert at midnight to ring in the new year. Yeah.
Wow, good for you. I was definitely not that adventurous as a 13-year-old. But all right, well, that was kind of your early days. Describe to us now kind of where things are at, how things change for you over time. Are they virtually the same? Are they different? In what ways?
I would say they are profoundly different. So I know people, it's now really like popular to talk about this idea of like deconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
I never, this was before, at least as far as I knew, that became a popular term. In retrospect, I've called it that I would say I went through an explosive deconstruction. Basically,
Oh.
I had a traumatic event that happened, and that's when I had my big, like, questioning moment.
Mm-hmm.
I had an older brother when I was in college, so my second to last year of college. Though my friends like to joke because I've continued to be in college. I have 4 degrees now.
Oh.
But so when I refer to in college, I mean
Yes.
like that first undergrad experience.
The normal
But,
in college
yeah,
age range.
when I was in college, my second to last year, my older brother died.
Oh my.
Suddenly, unexpectedly. From as far as I can tell, it was an accidental drug overdose. I don't believe he committed suicide intentionally. Though you can never know, I suppose. But yeah, he was like a recreational drug user, and I think he just took too much of something and he died. But that was a huge change for me. I would say I went through a 2-month period of what I would just call like atheism, like where I just completely rejected the whole thing. And then I came back to faith, but I would call my current view, and it's funny because maybe before this, I would have not, I might not have looked at this, the younger me would have not looked at this term as favorably. I would call myself more of like a mystical Christian now.
Oh, sure.
Like I just embrace the fact that there are mysteries to the whole thing. I reject the whole like foundational premise that I could figure all of this stuff out. Like I reject that idea. Whereas, before that, I really thought I was going to be an apologist whose whole job was to tell you the right answers to these things. Now I reject that whole idea. And that was a slow thing. It wasn't like that happened over many years, but 2 months or so of totally rejecting the whole thing, then coming back to it, but basically becoming sort of a universalist in a sense. Because, and this is just personally driven, maybe emotionally driven, having been this like sure sort of conservative evangelical Christian, I didn't want to believe that my brother was in hell, basically, because it seemed like that's what my previous belief system would have told me. That at least it was definitely possible, because he was definitely not any sort of practicing or professing Christian. He might have been when he was younger. So, if you believe in, the perseverance of the saints, all of the supertones, if you believe in the perseverance of the saints, then maybe he was saved. But I just rejected that whole thing for a while, and then I came back to it, but just holding it much more loosely, basically. Eventually, though, and I would say this is where my studies in philosophy sort of influenced things. That's how I ended up where I am today, where I am mostly influenced by, though I don't know how many of our listeners here will have read or be very familiar with, but William James. William James was a psychologist. He was the founder of the first experimental psychology department at Harvard. That was the first one in the United States back in the 1800s. He is also, though, he overlaps into philosophy and is sort of lumped in with the only American like philosophical movement that we think of in philosophy, at least, which is pragmatism. He's considered a pragmatist philosopher, but his views on faith really just resonated with me. Because I've also always been someone, even when I was like a much more sort of conservative Christian, I've always been very good at like the scientific fields. And for those who don't know, I'm a nurse now. I'm a registered nurse in an emergency department. I'm a trauma nurse and an ER nurse.
Wow.
And I've always been very good at, just naturally, that seemed to be my gift, is like I excelled in the sciences. Like I would often be one of the top in my class in various scientific courses I took in high school and into college. And so, but it resonated with me because James offers his own sort of take on, well, how do you make these two things work together? You know, your sort of scientific reasoning on the one hand and faith on the other. And William James gives us an account where he says there's sort of three factors that allow us to sort of take this faith in something. Because he's like, look, there's some things where we can just find a scientific answer. You don't need faith for that. That itself is a questionable premise, but I'm just explaining what William James said. So the things that where you can take faith, he gives us three, and it's funny because I literally explained this to Brock during a bike ride yesterday.
You were prepping
so
for the
just
show.
Preparing myself. Yeah.
Thanks for doing our work for us, Brock.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Brock.
Exactly. William James said there's three criteria to make the sort of leap of faith. The leap of faith being like Kierkegaard's term for it. But William James says it must be live, forced, and momentous. So live just meaning like it is a real option for you. Like there's some things you could not bring yourself to believe, right? Like it would be very difficult for me to bring myself to believe that there are like elves that live in the walls of my apartment that are like responsible for carrying electrons to make this light work or something. Like there are certain beliefs that are just not live for me. It would be very difficult or impossible for me to make myself to believe them. So they have to be live. According to James, they have to be forced, which basically means that you can't just ignore it. And according to James, like the existence of some sort of divine or like God is like a forced thing. Like once you at least understand the concept, you either believe it or you don't. So like in a way you are forced to make this choice, because even if you choose to be an agnostic, according to James, that sort of just means you're choosing not to believe it, right? You are not assenting to believing it. And momentous, meaning it will have like a big impact on how you live your life. So when I got exposed to William James, which I think was towards maybe in college and more into grad school, because I did start focusing on philosophy of religion when I got to grad school. I realized that's what I wanted to do. But then later, to get to where I am now, I got into Kierkegaard. And I think Kierkegaard and James have a lot of overlap. But Kierkegaard is basically often called the proto-existentialist or the father of existentialism. But he was a Christian. In particular, he was a Lutheran Christian because he was Danish and the state church is Lutheran in Denmark, at least at that time. So eventually I get into Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, I think, is very similar to James. In fact, I've got a book I need to read by C. Stephen Evans, where he compares the epistemology of Kierkegaard, William James, and Immanuel Kant.
Oh, wow.
Because I do think there's sort of a confluence there. Good. But that might be getting too philosophy nerdy.
I couldn't tell you.
It's like the ultimate philosophy.
Yeah, that might be a lot. So just the Kierkegaard... one book that got me into Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard was often called the father of existentialism, or is often called the father of existentialism, or at least a proto-existentialist. Though existentialist ideas go way back. In fact, people will sometimes say that the book of Ecclesiastes is a proto-existentialist work in the Bible.
Sure.
But Kierkegaard, being this like 19th century Danish fellow, Denmark at that time at least, and I'm assuming still, I don't know, they were a Lutheran country. And so he grows up Lutheran. He actually thinks he wants to be a minister. And he does a lot of ministerial stuff later in life. I'm not going to get into his whole biography. But what I take from Kierkegaard is that Kierkegaard, and this is what makes him sort of postmodern or existentialist, he's really rejecting this very idea that we can just use arguments to get there. Basically, he would reject this whole apologetics project. He attacks the church. So he had enemies on both sides because he thinks the church at that time is doing a lot of horrible things. But yet he's not an anti-theist. He's not an atheist. He is a devout Christian who just thinks there's problems with the established church that he's living in. So he has like friends and enemies on both sides. There's this whole like cadre of young people and who are rejecting religion, who think he's awesome because he's attacking the church. But yet he's like, wait a second, I'm not telling you to reject Christ. I'm telling you to reject the church, which he says are two very different things. He actually writes a bunch of discourses that are like beautiful, like theological works that I think a lot of modern readers don't even care about. Like he writes like treatises on different verses in the Bible. Like, so he has these two parallel projects where he's doing his like ministerial stuff on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's actually attacking the church as it stands.
Yep.
But the thing I take from Kierkegaard, and one book really got me into it, which is called The End of Apologetics. And I think it's sort of a play on words, because you could mean end as in like the finish, or maybe the end as in like the teleological end. Like what is the purpose of apologetics? But The End of Apologetics, I think the author's name is Penner. I have forgotten, but I read that book, and it really explained the sort of existential way, like an existential Christianity, rejecting the whole idea of apologetics as like, look, we can't argue people into Christianity. You have to just build relationships with people. That's how you actually convince people. It's not by laying out arguments. So that was a big change for me, coming from this point of, because even when I came back to Christianity after that big like dark night that I went through,
Sure.
I think I was basically holding the same sort of thing, just being less sure of it. But finally I found Kierkegaard and William James and was able to say, no, there's actually like a reasonable way to look at all of this. So yeah, Kierkegaard is going to reject the whole apologetics project. And then another book that really influenced me and made me think that there's something to this Kierkegaard guy is called Existentialism, The Philosophy of Despair and the Quest for Hope by C. Stephen Evans, who is one of the world's leading Kierkegaard scholars. And in it, he basically lays out an argument for Christianity, or for Christian belief, that is wholly based on meaning. So it might be similar. So if you are someone who's into apologetics, it might be similar to almost like the moral argument in a way, that, you know, we have to have some grounding for our morality in God. But it's more about meaning. And basically, C. Stephen Evans, being like an existentialism scholar, says, look, we can look at Kierkegaard's Christian existentialism, we can look at Sartre's existentialism, and we can look at Camus' absurdism, and compare them all. And really the only one, according to Evans, that's going to give you meaning is, you know, the Christian existentialism of Kierkegaard. So that had a huge influence on me. But yeah, basically Kierkegaard, and to sum it up, Kierkegaard in his book Either Or, which is one of his earlier works, his whole point is that there's these two characters who see the world in different ways. One of them is just like trying to seek pleasure. The other is this guy who is trying to like live a life according to a set of rules. And it seems that Kierkegaard's point is like within each one, they might be within their own like internally consistent system. So it's almost like two islands, and you're not going to build a bridge between them.
Mm-hmm.
So one cannot argue the other one into joining in their system. So basically, yeah, I've rejected that whole being an apologist thing because
Your youthful dreams are dead. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I still identify myself as a Christian. I pray, I read the Bible, I go to church occasionally, though I'm having trouble with the fact that the church I go to is rather conservative, and so it doesn't really align with my own views really great. So I've thought about trying to go to a church that might be a little more on the theologically liberal side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's where I am.
Wow. Hold on, I'm taking all those notes down. Existentialism. Caleb, back me up. You're taking notes too, right?
All I wrote down was William James has a good beard. Is that going to be helpful?
He does have a great beard. William James, and oh my gosh, last year I read Miguel de Unamuno, who was a Basque existentialist who might have been a Christian, but Del Sentimiento Tragico de la Vida, The Tragic Sense of Life, which, yeah, I loved that book, because it's all about how horrible things are.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's about how horrible life is. So, yeah, I loved it.
So one of the things you just said that popped out to me, I've always really been interested in that theological argument about a proof for God being whether our morality is, is foundational. If God does not exist, then where do we get our morals from? Because really, for many, many years, especially coming out of youth group, high school, and college, that was a really big argument piece for me. It's like, well, it's just very simple. If God does not exist, how do we know what's right and wrong, kind of thing. And then it started to get into a few more when I was in seminary, particularly Stanley Hauerwas. Like, he made some really good arguments why that wasn't the best use of our positioning for whether God is real or not. So this is a super interesting argument.
That is a thorny, that is like a briar patch to enter into. To also use a term that they like to use in Star Trek, they've entered the briar patch. But yeah, that is because it's not my favorite. So if I am to get back into, if I put my apologetics hat back on,
right,
it would not be my preferred theological argument, in part because it upsets people. It becomes very personal, because people will say, "Oh, you're telling me I cannot be a moral person because I don't believe."
Right.
So it's never been my personal favorite argument. I can tell you my favorite apologetics argument. I I can, believe it or not. Yeah.
I wouldn't have never guessed.
I'm gonna write this down too,
because I actually I never got anything published. Before I sort of ended my almost beginning philosophical career.
Yep.
I never got anything published, but I did get into a couple different prestigious conferences and present some of my work. One was at Princeton, and that was at the Princeton Rutgers Graduate Philosophy Conference, the most prestigious philosophy conference for graduate students. But that was on an ethics thing that you guys probably don't care about. But I also presented a paper on grounding. So grounding is this philosophical concept, this metaphysical concept that what does something depend on? In virtue, why is there a chair here? What are the reasons? What's the undergrounding metaphysical, is it it's made up of its parts and those are here? So this is getting into very weird metaphysical territory within philosophy. But I wrote a paper where I argued I would call this a type of cosmological argument. In fact, I think it's what the sort of modern period thinker Leibniz, the philosopher Leibniz, he gives this sort of argument. So I called it like a Leibnizian cosmological argument. Basically, I tried to argue that God is the best like grounding of all physical existence. Because all the physical world, none of it seems to be necessary, right? Like it all seems to be here contingently. The whole physical world seems to be made up of things that you could have a possible world where they don't exist. So if God, though, is like a necessary being, then it doesn't need an explanation for why it's there, because it's just necessarily there. It doesn't need to be grounded in anything else. So that's my favorite. Which might not be many people's favorite, but that's my favorite theistic argument, is what I would call the Leibnizian cosmological argument. So instead of being like a cosmological argument based on cause and effect, like the classic sort of cosmological argument that William Lane Craig likes to champion with his Kalam cosmological argument, this is a cosmological argument, but based on the idea of metaphysical grounding. So that's my favorite.
Caleb, I think we've bitten off more than we can chew.
I wrote down Batman good. That's all I'm really out of my depth here.
No, I followed that Leibnizian. Like that's a really interesting. I've never heard that before. Like I thought.
Yeah, Leibniz offered. I mean, Leibniz's whole philosophy is wild. So if you ever want to study, a philosopher and be like, this guy has some weird ideas, Leibniz is one of them. But yeah, that's I love his cosmological argument, because it's instead of based on cause and effect, it's based on this idea of grounding. Yeah, or like that's what we'd call it in modern philosophical terms, is grounding.
Sure.
The grounding problem.
Well, I do need a new book to read, so maybe pick that one up.
Yeah, maybe there's some good books on Leibniz out there.
There's gotta be. There's
gotta be.
Well, from that perspective of like just all this philosophy that you've clearly enjoyed consuming very much, like, can you take that and look back on your youth group experience and look at maybe some of the teachings or some of the philosophy apologetics that were going on? You're like, hey, I kind of struggle with this. This was not something we should have taught or we should have talked about.
That is a good question.
Thank you.
I definitely, if anything, like the thing that I would say about that younger period, like my period in youth group, is that they should make it more relational. And there's like a pastoral term. Like that's I feel like relational seems like a term that like one would use when talking about church related things. We need to make this relational. But I would take that seriously, that, and it's not to say that nobody ever did that. Like I think a lot of Christians do take an interest in building relationships. But I would not so much try to tell people like, hey, I'm going to go over these arguments, and these are the arguments you can use to try to convince somebody to believe this. Now, there is something to be said. The Bible does tell us to be able to give an account for what we believe. So I do think there's definitely a place for trying to understand things, and being able to explain what you believe. But I think that whole project of, the apologetics project, I think, is misguided. So that would be the biggest thing that I would say, that was an error to me.
I find that an interesting answer because when we talked about what you loved about youth group and what your positive memories were, it was the relationships that you were building, but within the youth group, right? And so
maybe there was foreshadowing there.
But I think it's a little bit of an interesting dichotomy because I understand what you're saying. Like, the relationships inside youth group, they were trying to cultivate those so we could all have our Christian friends and we could, for lack of a better word, have a bubble we could be safe in for the most part. And then when it came to our outside Christian friends, and maybe I'm not doing it justice enough, but it was more of, you have to convince them this way. You have to be able to talk to them in a way where you're making a convincing statement about the gospel, about Jesus, so they will convert, as opposed to, hey, why don't we teach you how to live in relationship with people who may believe differently than you, so as to trust that God is going to work in their lives through you in some way at some point. And it's not necessarily all about the invitation to an event or something like that. Even though those are important, it wasn't. It was more about kind of holding up a wall of protection versus getting involved in their lives.
Yeah, and I that's a good point, because I would, like, thinking back, now I remember, we had like a lock-in at my church, and I did invite some of my school friends, like one of my good friends who was Catholic. So that was sort of fun, bringing him to our Protestant church, for
Nice.
a lock-in. One of my other memories, and yeah, all of these do involve, in a sense, some relational aspect. The pastor that I grew up with, because that was part of why we ended up leaving and going to a different church, is our pastor left. And then my parents didn't get along with the new pastor we got. But our previous pastor, Steve Richard, and I still keep in contact with him via Facebook, so maybe I'll share this with him. Be like, hey, Steve, you should listen to this podcast.
Steve, come on the show. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Steve. Yeah, you were a good pastor, and now I think you're like a stock trader or something.
Wow.
So got out of the ministry to... though he also worked as a bike mechanic, which I later did. What a connection.
There you go.
He was a minister full-time, but the church didn't pay much, so he also worked as a bike mechanic at a local bike shop to help keep his family alive. But Steve allowed us to have concerts at the church. Like, we had Christian rock concerts. Like, we had local ska and alternative and punk bands and stuff come play at the church. We had a few of those. I was pretty young, and I was not involved with organizing those, but a couple of the kids who were a little older than me, they were organizing those. Like, because some of them, and I don't even remember some of these guys' names, one of them was involved with one of the sort of local Christian punk bands. Nice. So I think that was his connection. He's like, hey, I go to this church. We can get some shows put together there. If I recall, because I think many Christians have used the term Ichthus to name their bands and other projects. I'm pretty sure that their name was Ichthus, this
course.
local Christian punk band we had here.
Yeah.
Because I went to a few of their concerts, like at our church and at a local park just outside, and I actually live right by that park still today. But yeah, we had concerts at the church. One of the ska bands that I was able to discuss with Caleb on his show was Seven, which was a Christian ska band from Lincoln, Nebraska. So
nice.
Those are just some other good youth group memories.
For sure.
But yeah, they all do involve the relational aspect of things.
Yep.
I do suppose one can get too far to that side. And I guess this is this is not the podcast for that, but yeah, one could get too far to it's all about just building relationships, but if you never actually try to explain like what you believe in or anything, then nobody else is gonna get it. You're sort of gonna be hiding your light under a bushel. So
good pull there. No, yeah, it's finding that balance a little bit, right? Yeah. Like, I just go back to there being like a sense of fear, like you were saying a little bit earlier. One exposure to something, and then all of a sudden it's a temptation. Like, no, it's not necessarily how it all works. Like, give them a little bit of strength and encouragement and trust to be involved in the lives of someone around them who's not going to church or is not a Christian, but not so much, not even just with the intention of inviting them. And especially today, I think everyone can see right through that. Like, learn how to be fully invested in somebody who you're close with, who may not believe the same things as you. And that's a lifelong thing. It doesn't happen instantly, but still, it's not a bad place to start when we're that age.
Yeah, and like that concert I put together when I was whatever it was, like 13ish, I think. Well, I guess I could do the math. How old was I at the year 2000? It would have been more like 18, I suppose. But anyway, I was still pretty young. I wasn't able to drive myself or anything. But we had, so we had this local Christian alternative band. And, there's nothing about them on the internet because I think, they were broken up by the time a lot of people were putting anything on the internet. I do still have one of their CDs, but they were called Jacob's Well, also after a biblical story. And I think they were not so much for the idea of they were not going to stop, though, and do a little, sermonette during their thing. So my dad did that for them.
Gotcha.
Basically, we had, a little intermission, and my dad was like, look, he's like, okay, there's... he referenced someone else, I think there was, a Christian guy who had been, a football coach. Maybe he was even, one of the assistant coaches on, for the Nebraska Cornhuskers.
Oh, and back in the day, that was a big deal. I mean,
yeah,
I know it's still a big deal, but, they were...
But, yeah,
very
he had, a 2-minute drill sermon. Just, a gospel message sermon.
Sure.
But because it's football, the 2-minute drill. So my dad's like, yeah, I've got this little 2-minute drill sermon I will give. And we will do that, as sort of the intermission in this alternative rock Christian band set, basically. So so all that to say, I created this social fun event, but I was like, hey, we're gonna make sure we give this gospel message.
Yeah.
So
exactly. Well, say spent a lot of time with us here. Thanks for bringing us this far. What would your 18-year-old self say to your adult self, and vice versa? What would that conversation sound like?
That was the toughest part of this whole thing. When I was looking at your list, I was like, what would my 18-year-old self... I think as traumatic as this is, I feel like my younger self might be somewhat disappointed. Having been this diehard Christian conservative evangelical, you've become this wishy-washy mystical Christian, universalist. You don't even think that people are damned to hell forever? What's wrong with you?
What are we doing here?
What are we even doing? What's the purpose of all this? If I can't believe that some people I don't like are in hell. So
I'm surprised more people have not said that.
Yeah.
We've been asking this question for a year and a half now. And I still have not answered this question because I'm kind of putting it off because I don't want I've struggled with this question as well because I've tried to answer some of these myself. I'm actually surprised more people haven't said that we haven't gotten I think 18-year-old me would be really disappointed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Jared said it a couple weeks back. But yeah, we haven't had a lot of wow, I would be super angry, because that's kind of my answer too. Is I would be disappointed in myself today for sure.
Yeah,
I think I mean, in other ways too. I think younger self, because when I graduated high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. But by the time I was in college, there was definitely an inflection point where I thought either because I was just so good at the sciences. But I always wanted to help people. I thought either I'd go into the medical field and go to medical school and be a doctor, or I'd go be a minister. I'm I'm either going to heal your body or I'm going to heal your soul. Those are the two things I thought that I might end up doing. And I do work in the medical field now. I'm a nurse. But I think my younger self would be sort of surprised at the course this all took. Because I ended up going and doing philosophy, but ending with a master's degree. And then becoming a paramedic for a decade, and then finally deciding, well, I'm going to stay in this sort of role. I might as well have a lot more career options and make twice as much money, and I became a nurse. So that's basically been my career path. Though I've used my philosophy degree. For a long time, for quite a few years, while I was a paramedic, I was also part-time adjunct instructor at a university here.
Oh, cool.
I was actually teaching at my alma mater, and they really enjoyed having me because I would teach medical ethics. And they're like, hey, we actually have someone who's worked in the medical field, but also has a background in philosophy. So they're allowed to be here teaching in the philosophy department. They liked having me teach medical ethics because I could use my own cases too. Like I would tell students stories like based on like actual cases I've seen, and the students really liked that.
Sure.
So I've used it, and I'd like to get back to teaching someday. But yeah, I think my younger self would at least be surprised at the course this is all taken, and perhaps a little disappointed. And I guess to flip this on its head, what would I say to that younger self? One, I'd probably tell him to go to med school. Because I think that's what I would have rather done at the end of all this. Though I try to live life without really regretting these things because that's not fruitful.
Right.
And also I made a lot of great friends in grad school and studying philosophy. So like it's hard to say. I wouldn't want to give all those up though either, right? So, but if I could just have life to do over again, hypothetically, it's like, yeah, maybe I should have gone to medical school. I could be a doctor. I'd have like an established career, and all that stuff at this point in life. Whereas now I'm just sort of just starting as a nurse, basically. And I'm 40 years old. So yeah, but as far as the theological thing, I think I would tell my younger self to at least check out, these like Kierkegaard, basically. So that's my message to all of you. Go check out Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard himself is a dense read.
Yep.
So, maybe read some books about Kierkegaard to dip your toes in the water. That book, The End of Apologetics by Penner, is a good place to start because he references a lot of Kierkegaard. And then books by C. Stephen Evans, because these books were around then, especially the book by C. Stephen Evans. That book was written like before I was born. Like it's actually out of print, so I had to find a copy used. But his book, Existentialism, the Philosophy of Despair and the Quest for Hope. And I think that would possibly have opened my eyes a little younger to the idea that, there's another way to see all this. I don't have to be so dogmatic. So that's
good. I mean, I can identify with that. Like, you kind of tell your younger self to chill out a little bit.
Exactly. And I think that's a common thread I've noticed in conversations like on this show, but also on, because I listened to a few of these other podcasts related to like the whole Christian music scene and everything. And I think that's a theme a lot of people have said is like telling their younger self to chill out a little bit. Definitely. I mean, I'd like to think I was always a relatively chill person, but in that one aspect, I think I could have chilled out a little bit. Though, I was never... So that people, because I think some people might take the message that I had some huge change, but I always felt that I was more sort of middle of the road, especially like politically. So when people are like, oh, philosophy and stuff turned you in to this like crazy liberal, I'm like, look, I was listening to Five Iron Frenzy when I was a child. Okay. Like I was,
don't understand. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that reference won't work for a lot of people in the world. But yeah, I was always, like when I would take like inventories, like they'd have you take these tests, like in junior high, we took a political inventory and I got like right in the middle. Like I was like a perfect centrist according to this test. So like I've never been like a hardcore, I'd say conservative. Yeah, on the theology front I was, in a sense. Mm-hmm. So yeah, just telling myself to chill out about that. And basically, that it would, make it relational, which I think I was good at, but also just, let go of the dogmatism about it, basically.
It's basically like your dad telling you to chill out, though, so they're probably not going to listen to us.
Exactly. Probably would not listen.
That's all right.
Though I would like to hope that I would be somewhat wise enough to be like, if I knew that this was my future self talking to me, I should at least pay attention.
Right.
Like, I might reject what they're saying,
right,
but I should at least pay attention. Like, wait, this is where I end up? Yeah. I should take a lesson from what this person, even if I do reject it, that's another just personal, to use the word philosophy, a personal, though I've always sort of cringed at using the word philosophy that way, but a personal philosophy of mine is you can learn from interacting with anyone. It doesn't mean you're going to end up agreeing with them.
Yeah.
But I've always felt you can learn from your interactions with anyone, even if it sometimes is, like, oh, I can learn that that's a train wreck and I need to avoid that train wreck or whatever. So yeah, hopefully I would at least listen if I didn't ultimately follow.
Right. It'd be a tough conversation to have, though.
Yeah,
I hear that.
I'm still not ready to answer these questions.
Come on, Caleb. You can do it.
I think because of those reasons, man, it's a lot of the reasons that you just said. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, Todd, overall, to kind of wrap things up, how does your 90s youth group experience contribute to the person you are today?
I think that my 90s youth group experience, I mean, one, it definitely probably has something to do with my current musical taste.
Nice.
That's a big connection. Though I've always been a bit of a lone wolf in that, like, I don't think I got into, for example, like Five Iron Frenzy or the Insiders or the Supertones because my friends were into it. They were probably into like cooler bands or whatever.
There's no cooler bands.
Say,
exactly. I'm sorry.
I'm deleting this episode.
What could be cooler?
Come on.
Like, I'm sure they're listening to, I don't know, Reliant K or Toby Mac.
Oh boy.
But no, I think it definitely, because I was the kid who I just went to like the Christian bookstore as I wandered around the mall, and that's how I actually first got into some of the music I listened to. I just found it at the Christian bookstore. But as far as the impact, I think that sense of community, and who knows, maybe that's part of why I keep creating these things, right? Like, I've got a cycling club. Maybe it's because I want to have this sense of community, When I was in grad school, our department, like our grad students, appointed me, because we had like our own little grad student government. They made a new position. I was the minister of sport. It was my job to organize like athletic endeavors for the philosophy department. So like,
whoa,
we played intramural sports and stuff, like, and that was all my organizing. And also I just organized, we would have our own, like, just a pickup soccer game in the middle of the campus or whatever. So I've always been about trying to put stuff together. And in a sense, a lot of that is stuff we would have done like when I was at my church. We were out there playing basketball. We were out there like sledding on the hill behind the church. We were doing things we weren't supposed to, like walking down the train tracks behind the church. And luckily nobody ever got run over, So like the sort of activities we did together, that's, I would say, the thing that I bring from all of it. That and just knowing that community can be so important for people. I think that's why a lot of this stuff, like looking back at my youth group experience, my experience, like it being into music, my experience being into like having like a group of people to do bike activities with. Ultimately, it's because community is part of how people get happiness, basically, right? Like where people find joy, where the philosopher Aristotle thought that friendship was one of the highest ends that we have. So I think that he might have been onto that. He also thought walking was good for you, and I think he was right about that. So,
maybe.
Yeah. And that it helped produce better bowel movements. So yeah, he had lots of things to say, Aristotle. That were correct. So yeah, walk and be part of a community are two things you can learn from Aristotle. Yeah.
Well, man, this has been super fun. It definitely took some angles I was not prepared for, especially, I had no idea about the whole philosophy thing, and I find it fascinating that it just dived right into it, and it defines so much of how you think today. So
I think that it's like a pressure relief valve. I think these ideas have been in my head. It's like, hey, I've got an audience for a second. I can tell these guys about these things.
Right.
So yeah, I'm still working on this project. Maybe it'll come out this year, where I'm trying to look at themes from Kierkegaard that are found in the works of one Reese Roper.
Whoa.
So yeah, I think that I'm actually, maybe Caleb, you can ask Reese, did he read a lot of Kierkegaard when he was younger? That's something I need to know, because it seems that he has a lot of Kierkegaardian ideas in the songs that he writes.
I feel like if there's a chance, he could have.
Yeah.
Like, Reese has always been pretty well read.
I have no idea, and I think the best way to potentially get that question to him would be to try and do the see if they finally get around to it on their podcast of interviewing people who are Patreon people at a certain level. That might be your only way to get that question to him.
That's why I'm at that level. That's the whole reason I'm paying $10 a month.
The question is, will they ever get to that? That's the real question.
They've done like one or two, haven't they? I know they've done
one.
at least one.
Yeah,
one. Okay.
They're not.
Yeah.
I love them. I have no trust in their ability to succeed as a podcast that follows through on their promises. And I love them dearly, but I just don't trust them.
Understandable.
Well, Todd, thanks, man. I really appreciate you spending so much time with us on a beautiful afternoon. It's been really fun to chat with you. Even, again, we tried to do this multiple times and finally made it work, and it was worth it. So,
well, thank you for having me on. It's been a good time.
Yes, thanks for sharing your story with us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. Once again, we do want to say thanks to Todd for taking time out of his day to talk with us about his experience. It was great to have him on the show. Obviously, he has thought long and hard about the issues of faith and kind of his experience and where he's at. So it was great to have him on the show. Let us know what you thought about this show or any of our other shows. You can find us on Twitter at the handle @SurvivedYG, and you can also email us at isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. And we're always looking for guests. That's how this show survives, as we continue to hear different stories, different people, their opinions on where they're at now, and their experiences in that youth group, whether it was in the 90s or the 2000s or 80s and 70s, if you want to really get into it. We'd love to have you on the show. Please email us. We're not always great about the Twitter handle, but if you send an email to that, isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to talk. We'd love to have you on the show. Please subscribe and share the podcast. If you're so inclined, please leave a rating or a review. If you enjoy the show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a music podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Again, over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. I invite somebody onto the show so they can talk about an album they love or an album that's important to us. Again, it's called the Album Anniversary Podcast. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, sure.
So, basically, I'm about to tie this all up into a bow. I don't know.
Let's just before you jump in and finish your Kierkegaard Danish Christian thought. I think so, Scott. I want to talk for you. I think you thought this was what the show was going to be much more about when we first started this, like people going into their philosophy and theology.
That's what I wanted. Yeah,
it's turned much more into like Caleb's dumbed it down. He can't keep up. So we're just going to talk about stories. So I'm totally kidding about that joke. But this is actually, I think, where Scott kind of thought the show would go originally, and then it's not everybody can go this deep on it. So anyway, sorry.
Hopefully someone's interested.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting. I mean, this is what we want. We want to hear people how they got there.
Why?
So. Okay, so Danish Christian.
Okay, I'll jump back in here.